Hello, it's Scott McArthur here. Thank you very much for tuning in again to ARTEFACT, the art and science of storytelling. Now, an email came flooding in this week, which got me thinking about how I should introduce this. And I think I'm not going to be using one of my artifacts this week. My guest is going to be using an artifact, but I'm going to tell you an artifact story to start things off because it's quite important to understand why I decided to start this show. Part of it was because it's my job. I tell stories for a living. I'm a professional speaker, at least I was before COVID. And I guess I still am in video, but I had an experience in my life where I think the need to be able to tell stories came quite early to me in terms of how to communicate with grown-ups. I started my life, obviously I'm Scottish and I grew up in Scotland, and but I had a couple of periods where I was out of the country, and indeed I had my first and my second country, first and second birthdays in Ireland. And then after a year in Scotland, we then went off to the Caribbean, and I had 2 or 3 birthdays in the Caribbean on the beautiful island of Antigua. And during that time, I went to school for the first time, and that was an interesting experience because at the time Antigua wasn't what it's like now, which is a built-up tourist centre. It was actually just a lump of rock with a few palm trees and some old wooden huts, and we lived in a house on the top of a mountain. And my first school was actually on a radio ham, and I used to every morning come out of my room, come into the kitchen and have my breakfast, and on the table would be this old-fashioned I don't know what were they like, what were they called, CBs? Yeah, you know, the broadcast things you used to have with the over, and that was how I went to school. And I learned standard English that way. Then we came back to the UK, and in fact back to Scotland, and I went to proper school. And on my first day, I think I was 7. I might have been 6. Mum and Dad, if you're watching, you can tell me. But let me just check that everything's working. Can you hear me? Can people hear me? Just make sure before I keep prattling on here that you can actually hear me. I'm getting a yep. Okay. And I went into the school, first day, sat down in English, and my teacher was a lady called Mrs. Dunlop. And Mrs. Dunlop was very nice, and she handed me a book. And it was like a rabbit, one of those rabbit stories. Can't remember the name of the rabbit. Peter Rabbit. And I opened the book and I couldn't understand a word of it. You see, I grew up in my early school days was in the 70s. And at that time, as they still seem to be doing, they were experimenting. Thanks, Peter, for letting me know you can hear me. Thank you. And Doug as well. Thank you. At that time, they were experimenting with how they taught kids English. I'd been taught Queen's English in Antigua, but I'd come back to the UK, and this thing arrived called ITA. Now, if you've never heard of it, it's Initial Teaching Alphabet. It's the oddest thing. Let me show you an example. This was the book that they gave me. Book. Of course, to me, that looked like a W or a bottom. And I was completely knocked. I couldn't understand it. It didn't make any sense because to me, book was spelled B-O-O-K. But in this ITA language, I was, just shocked. And all the little dendrites in my brain were very confused. So I spent the next 6 years really struggling with English, and really struggling to the point that I ended up in remedial English and being told that I was stupid. The schools in Lanarkshire and Scotland weren't particularly enlightened either in those days, so it wasn't particularly pleasant. But so I had a real problem with English for a long, long time. And I, to this day, struggle. I don't have dyslexia. I don't have any of some of the, the word blindness type things, but I still write my sentences back to front. So it takes me twice the time to write a sentence it does a lot of other people. And I still get my words confused and confabulated. So language means a lot to me. And it's something that I know, as those of you who have watched me before know, I love language. And I read at least one book a week. I'm an avid reader of poetry, and I love going to the theatre, but I still struggle with it. And I think it's why I'm so fond of the audio form of language, because I can sit down and really get engrossed in that. Whereas reading a book is not as easy for me still to this day. I get sort of confused by it. So I put it all down to Mrs. Dunlop. However, there was one moment when I was leaving school where I got awarded the English prize for the school, which I'll never forget it. I don't know how I got that. I think it was because of my storytelling, to be honest. My English has never been that good. My use of vocabulary and punctuation has never been that good. But so anyway, that was one of the reasons why I think I became so interested in storytelling. And that's why tonight is quite an interesting one for me. I'm looking forward to this because the guy who I've got as a guest is brilliant. And I think we've got, again, I think Joanne said, who's one of our regulars, said last week, I think we need to do more on comedy. We need to do more on music. We will need to do more on language. This is the first little taster of it, but it's a good one because I've got someone who really knows what they're talking about. So that's what we're doing tonight. But that's a little bit of the reason and the motivation why I decided to really, or how I got into storytelling and why I think it's important that we talk about it. I hope that makes sense. Let me just check the chat before we go on to the next part. Peter's saying it looks Welsh. It does. It was the oddest thing, and it's a bit like what my kids do phonics just now, and I also find that quite interesting and quite difficult to comprehend. I know it's not for me to comprehend, and if there's any teachers in, I'm sure you will tell me that it works. But I still find it difficult. It's I think the other one I remember was Jesus. It was Jeezus. Really, when you've taught proper English, then you're taught another way. It was really quite discombobulating, Peter, and it might as well have been Welsh because I had no clue what was going on. But so I don't know if it was a good thing or a bad thing for other children, but for me, it wasn't great. It wasn't great. So what we're going to talk about tonight? Well, obviously my guest and I have had a chat, and I'll introduce Ben to you in a minute. But I am also now very interested in language because of what's been happening in the world. There are, 7,000 odd different languages. The way we see the world is through language. I'm interested to hear what Ben's got to say about, how does that affect how we take part in the world, etc. And of course, with the rise of Trumpistan and his acolytes, there's also been a whole sort of reflection on stories I heard when I was a child, like 1984, and talking about newspeak, etc., etc. So I'm interested in language generally, but what I'm hoping to do tonight is really I want to listen and learn, because I've got somebody here, as I say, Ben Afia, who really understands language. So Ben, I think I'll introduce you now, if you don't mind. I'll put your camera on. So any questions, guys, and I can answer them well before this. What's Ben got here? Doug, sorry. Doug's saying school processes messed me up until I was about 30. Are you 30? What happened, Doug? What happened? Tell us what happened in the text while I get Ben on the screen. So here's Ben. Hi, Ben. Welcome to the show.
Scott. Thank you, Scott. Good to be here.
So, sorry, there's a longer introduction than usual, Ben, because there was a real reason why I was so keen to have you on here today, which you've now heard. I've never told that story before. Have you heard of ITA? Is that something you're familiar with?
I haven't, no, and I didn't know that you learnt your English from such random places, actually. So we're going to have to talk about that over a pint when we're next allowed.
Yeah. It was very odd. I have to say, I quite enjoyed the Radio Ham way of being taught, because I guess I was a virtual student in the 1970s. And there you go. Take that, all you virtual speaking experts.
Yeah.
But it was, it was very structured, Ben. So you had to, it was all this sort of high miss over, that type of dialogue. So it was difficult.
I'm getting the same thing for my kids with phonics now. It's extraordinary. My children, so they're 14 and 16 now, but when they were in junior school, they were learning as well. And later, they've been learning really structured grammar, which I never learnt at school. So if you were at school in the UK in the 70s and 80s, we didn't do grammar properly. They stopped teaching grammar. It's all come back in. I find it quite remarkable, because I've managed to create a business using language, and I didn't do grammar formally at school. So something must have worked out.
Yeah. So what did I mean? I often have this debate with my other half because she went to a very posh school, and at that very posh school, she did get taught a lot of grammar and a lot of
Mm.
proper English. I didn't at any point. So is it something you think has been deliberately excluded from the curriculum, or is it just because it's too difficult, or why is it that we don't seem to have a deep experience with it when we're children?
Yeah. I think it was if you went to state schools across the UK in a certain period, they just weren't talking the rules of grammar. So we didn't learn about active verbs and passive verbs and the sorts of language that if you learnt grammar more formally, you probably learned. So there is a whole generation of people in this country who didn't learn that, and I'm not sure why it stopped. I think they thought it wasn't appropriate, and for some reason they brought it all back. Certain schools did carry on, so some people did get that. And interesting, when I'm thinking about when I'm talking to different audiences and different businesses about their audiences, who they might be writing to, we have to sort of understand where their audiences are in terms of their expectations of grammar, I suppose.
Right, right. I had do you know how there's and I had no intention of talking to you about this, but it's quite interesting. Do you know all these software pieces of software now you get, like
Mm,
Hemingway and
yeah.
various other ones? I've been using them now for some time, and I think the standard of particularly on LinkedIn and on if I'm writing an article, needs less editing than it did before. I mean,
Mm,
I'm definitely coming across better. But do you know what? It took me ages. I had to things like this is really embarrassing, and I hope Samantha, I hope you're not listening. You should
mm.
be mortified. But I had to look up things like change the order of that sentence because it's written in the passive, and I'm like, what does that mean? Do you know? I didn't know.
Yeah. And
I didn't know.
why should you? So that's only something I picked up since. And actually, one
Really?
of my sort of formative experiences in language and what really got into me. So I was working at Boots about 17 or 18 years ago. And my boss at the time was a real linguist. So she had done French and German at university. So she'd learned grammar really precisely. And it's interesting how people who didn't learn grammar in the UK actually probably know it better than us because they've had to learn the parts of speech and learn how it works more formally. So she had a very precise idea about grammar, and I had come out of schooling not with the same language, and so we came at it from very different directions. But that was quite interesting because if you think about the stories that Boots, the chemist, might be trying to tell, they have quite a wide range of audiences, don't they? They have beauty brands, beauty ranges, all the makeup and that sort of thing, and they've got pharmacy. Some quite serious subjects at another end, and then the general
Yeah.
mass of sort of over-the-counter medicine and all that kind of thing. So you've got quite a range of types of product that you're selling and services, which means you've got quite a range of different audiences. You've got different ages of people coming in, people with different backgrounds, different schooling. So you're going to have different expectations. So what we were trying to do is understand how, what's the most appropriate way for Boots to talk to people in different circumstances, how we're going to tell that story at different times.
Right. Okay. Okay. So how then? Before we go on, we should just today your business is about what? It is about language, isn't it? You specifically focus on language. Is that right, Ben? Keep me right.
Well, it's about language and culture,
Ah, right. Okay.
if that's not
Okay.
too great a leap. So
Yeah.
um, I guess since those days, I've helped quite a lot of businesses to get a sense of, work out what their language should be so that people throughout the organization can use it more consistently. So from marketing people to customer service people to operations people to lawyers, HR, all the way through an organization. And so over, fairly quickly, I realized that this language thing is really about the culture. It's about how
Right.
we relate to each other within the
Okay.
organization and outside the organization.
Mhm.
So language is about relationship, about culture. And so, and what I noticed is that unlike when you're trying to manage a brand, if you like, and manage a brand story, usually that's done from a visual perspective. So you'll tend
Mhm.
to, a big company will tend to hire an advertising agency or a branding agency from one of the large creative agency groups. And they tend to be quite visually driven. The emphasis is on advertising. And so it tends to be a visual approach.
Right.
What I noticed about language is that it reaches more people because the visual side of a brand or an organization is only really managed by marketers, by designers, by a certain number of people, whereas everybody's writing and everybody's speaking all day, every day. They're speaking to each other, speaking to colleagues, and they're speaking to customers, whether it's on the phone, whether it's on web chat, whatever way. So language actually reaches the whole of the organization.
Do you think that we are, I mean, I have a gut reaction to this myself, but I know social media gets a lot of flack, Ben. But I think there's an upside. There's a few upsides, and one of them is, I think, I might be wrong. I'm sure you'll tell me if I am, but that we're actually writing more today than we've ever written. My kids are always writing, and I know it's chunks.
Yeah.
Surely that must be a good thing.
I think it's absolutely a good thing, and I think so. I'm not a traditional grammarian, and maybe the reason, maybe because I didn't learn all the formality of grammar that you did if you went to certain schools at the time that we did, 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
So I don't have. I'm not obsessed with the detail of grammar. I'm obsessed with understanding. I think we need clarity.
Right.
But actually, there are a lot of rules or perceived rules in grammar that we think are rules, but they're actually not. They're actually matters of style. And some of those are being broken down by changing forms of text. So one of the things that the internet has done for us, I think, is it's changed how we write and to an extent how we speak. So the internet, so text and email, they sort of combine both written and spoken forms of speech. So do you remember in the olden days when people used to send formal letters signed dear sir and yours sincerely? Well, that happens from companies that are quite formal nowadays, but even those sort of salutations, sign-offs and salutations can, become less formal in most organizations. So I think the public's general, certainly in Western cultures in the UK in particular, the public's expectations of how organizations and people will speak with them, has changed, and it's become more conversational. So, I'm thinking about my daughter, she's 14, she's permanently glued to her phone, to her Snapchat. She's probably writing a lot more than I did at the age of 14 now, because she's constantly messaging her mates.
Yes.
So, yeah.
One thing that struck me in the last 6 months, I mean, this is one of these things about, contemporary language. I think I kind of saw this years ago, but I've realized that language it grows. It's not a static thing. And I've noticed that the full stop has disappeared, which is that just me, or is that a real trend?
In fact, there's some research just recently, and I read about this a couple of months ago, that apparently amongst younger generations, using full stops in text, in particular, or WhatsApp messaging platforms, is seen as rude. It's seen as abrupt and sharp. Now, I was a bit shocked to see this, because, to our sort of age, you finish a sentence with a full stop. But if you think of a message in text or in WhatsApp or Snapchat as an idea, a fully formed, each message is an idea, then pressing send and starting the next message is like a full stop. You've finished that sentence. So those full stops have fallen away, and so language is evolving, and language has always evolved. Language has always evolved. There is no one static idea of language. I think the French are quite keen to protect the French language, but we've not tried that about English, and luckily it's luckily that we haven't, because I think partly the freedom of English is one of the reasons that it's spread globally and become the global language of business.
That's interesting. Interesting. So do you think that and if you don't mind, I'll shift us more towards the story side now, because I said earlier in a show that got quite a response where I said, I don't really understand or can't advise you on quality of writing, because, Dan Brown could never be accused of being a good writer. In fact, he's an awful writer, but fantastic, success with his books. That Dan Brown style. This is a post-it, and in this post-it are some pages, and each page is individually stuck to each other page, and it goes on for about half an hour. Why is it? I mean, and I'll finish a sentence, and then I read some of the, like maybe a Pulitzer-winning book, and I can't read it. I pick up like Salman Rushdie, and everyone says this is brilliant, and all these people who tell me they're really good readers, and they say, oh, it's extraordinary, and I read and I go, I can't understand that.
Yeah.
Am I just
You're not alone. You're not alone.
Right.
So yes, my business is language, and I can't, but I'm useless with challenging literature.
Right.
Hilary Mantel, I really struggle with. I feel like I should get her. She's multi-award winning. She's read extraordinary things. I can't read
what
her.
has she written about, Ben? I don't know Hilary Mantel.
It's the all the stuff set around here Eighth's court, isn't it? Wolf Hall, that's it. And Wolf Hall, and Bring Out the Bodies. So there's a trilogy, and I downloaded the trilogy. Right. And I couldn't, and I got about halfway with Wolf Hall and I gave up. And that's probably shocking for people to hear, but I do think if you don't get into a novel quick enough, I mean, there's so much literature out there. Read what you like. I mean, I when I'm teaching, what I do feel that good reading is good writing. So if you want to be a good writer, you do need to read a lot. But you can actually read anything, I think. You can read challenging literature, and that can expand your vocabulary and extend you. But actually reading anything, you are learning to empathize with other human being situations. And this is what literature does for us. It transports us into another person's world, takes us into that world, out of our own world, and it teaches us empathy.
Yes.
So I don't think you don't need complex language to do that.
Yes. One of the key things I've been talking about in earlier shows, Ben, is exactly that. And I took from the former children's laureate, a chap called Riddell, who said that books and stories are an empathy engine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's just gorgeous. And I think it's absolutely right. Now, there's a couple of quotes, and I've just had a comment from someone that I must put on the screen, but I think it really is very appropriate, and I'd love your view on it. There's an old quote here from Rumi, who said, speak a new language so that the world will be a new world. And one of our regular tuners inners, as I like to say, one of our regular watchers, Joanne, has just said this, and I'd be interested in what you think on this, Ben. But Joe's just said, I have all the English exams and I'm a lawyer. We never studied grammar at school. Since I have been learning a new language, I know far more about the English grammar than I ever have. Isn't that interesting?
People learning English as a foreign language do learn more of the grammar. It's a more traditional form of teaching. I'm not sure why that is. And actually, if I have any sort of educational regrets, it's that I didn't take a second language far enough. I was all right at French and did a bit of German. Actually, thinking of a story, I had a wonderful teacher just before GCSE who would regale us with stories. He would tell us stories for, you had an hour's lesson and he would just stories for half an hour. And then he'd clap his hands and say, right, let's get down to work. We've had enough fun. And we'd all work really, really hard for half an hour. And we all came on really brilliantly in that class. So that was Mr. Cerebro. He was a lovely fellow. I then did well in French and I got put up to Madame Hanley. And Madame Hanley was a bit of a dragon. And she was so ferocious that she made me petrified of French. And I just got myself put back down again because I was having no more fun. And so sadly, and Mr. Cerebro left before GCSE choices came up. And so I didn't take GCSE French. But I think, as Joanna's saying, learning another language gives you access to another culture, another way of thinking. And I do think it's really interesting how different cultures have different words for different things. I was reading a piece just the other week in, I think, something about colors. And I think the Japanese don't have the same definition between green and blue that we have. Yes. And so in market research, they can't tell the difference in the same way that we can. They can't get to an answer as quickly. I'll look at that reference specifically. So different languages come from different ways of thinking, and then they're self-reinforcing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've heard the same story about Russia. They have two different types of blue. They have a light blue and a dark blue. And I said in the introduction about language having an impact on the way we think, and it does look like it significantly does. It would be interesting sometime, I don't know if you know anything about this, but how it impacts people who can't communicate via language, the deaf and the blind, or it would be fascinating to do that. But let me give you, there's one other thing that I think, another little quote here from one of the philosophers. I remember this, not this one, sorry, I put the wrong one on the screen, Egypt. This one here, and it says, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." And that's from obviously one of the old philosophers. And I remember reading 1984. I read 1984 almost in 1984, which is quite funny.
That's impressive.
Yeah, and I remember my teacher at the time, whose name has escaped me. I'm sorry, sir, if you're watching. But he said that this thing, the newspeak, as they called it, as Orwell called it, and it stuck in my memory. And I think a lot of people don't see it this way, but this is certainly how he taught me it. He said, the thing about newspeak, and therefore things like, the way that the politicians spin things, the way how, unfortunately, how companies spin things, Ben. What tends to happen is, according to my old teacher, and I think some Orwell's, certainly Christopher Hitchens said this as well, that the dictionary becomes shorter. Yeah. So therefore, you don't see the world as it really is. It limits. Is that similar to your thinking? Is that how you see it?
It is, absolutely. And I don't want to risk misquoting this, but I was reading at the weekend about what's happening in the States and what happens in totalitarian regimes and about storytelling. So totalitarian regimes blatantly recast the stories. They unpick history and retell history in order to retell a new future, to develop the stories of a new future. Now, this particular article that I picked up on at the weekend was talk about how the increase in democratic, the birth rate is meaning that Democratic voters in the US are on the increase, and Republicans are on the run. If Republicans don't maintain power at this stage, there's a good chance they're not going to get the presidency back. So the argument goes that actually they're supporting the recasting of this story, the retelling of this story, and the telling of new stories, and the blatant, confrontation of what we might call truth.
Yes.
As a way of creating a future, which in turn creates the paranoia that is engendered and is rife amongst Republican supporters. So storytelling is absolutely crucial. And if there's one thing that Trump has been absolutely phenomenal at, it's telling stories.
Yes. No, he has. And I think we could, in fact, I'm going to have a whole show on this, Ben. I'm going to have a whole show about story and politics, because I think there's a great case study there. It's one of the few things that, as you say, we're going to get from Trump's time, that the power of story, and the axiom that I like there is that, facts tell, but stories sell. So the story doesn't need to be true. It can still sell an idea or a notion.
Well, the story will always tell more than the fact.
Yeah.
Because humans are storytelling and story hearing and reading creatures. We communicate our major ideas, our major thinking through stories. And it's actually, we as logical, as rational people, we like to think that that's all persuade, but in fact, that's not how the human brain works. Humans receive stories as a framework for the facts. Yeah. And they can justify or rationalize what's going on, but the story will absolutely frame that fact. And if the framing's not right, then the story's not going to be believed.
Yes.
I actually think, I'm going to just touch on politics again, and we can then veer away quickly. Yes. But I remember hearing Gina Miller. Do you remember Gina Miller? She sued the government for over Article 50. Yeah. And I remember hearing her, so she was a Remain campaigner. And I can remember her saying, we just need to be a bit more rational. And at that moment, I realized what the fundamental flaw in the Remain campaign was. It was that it didn't use storytelling. It used facts. Yeah. But people don't listen to facts. They listen to stories. They understand stories. They internalize stories.
Yeah. Yes. I think, I'll let you get your artifact, Ben. While you're doing that, we've got some comments here that I would just like to if you can hear me while you're getting your artifact. Doug's just said, in response to his question, his comment earlier about his education, my brother was streamed into a top set, and me as a younger into the bottom set. I can guess where this is going. At 30, I broke my conditioned view of being stupid and went to Bristol Uni and got an MSc in management with distinction. Well done, mate. And I actually, Ben, you don't know, I actually know Doug, and he's not making that up. And I think it's amazing what he did. Is that something you've heard of? I mean, I know that happened to some of me and my friends, the sort of privilege debate about language, but it really does seem to be powerful, doesn't it, in terms of how those formative years can have such a massive impact on your psychology. Yeah,
absolutely.
There's another one. Yeah, on you go.
Our schooling has such a fundamental impact on us, and I do think it's. I can get on a bit of a high horse. I was a school governor for several years at the junior school my kids were at, so I got to kind of look at it from the inside. That was my way of contributing when I was busy traveling with business. Was to come back and give some time to the school, and I absolutely believe that the schooling is fundamental. It shapes our experience, but the problem with it is that it's based on a sort of Victorian idea of how we learn and what we should learn. And I think you and I have talked about this before. I absolutely believe in the focus on English and maths, but the problem with English and maths, and we need a certain level of those, but the problem with English and maths is that they're the sorts of things that machine learning is going to be able to copy much more quickly than other areas, other more creative areas. And so all of the schooling is still geared towards us acquiring knowledge rather than developing the skills that you and I know that we need in organizations, whether it's the NHS, whether it's in schools, whether it's in business. And those skills are really about creativity, and those are the things that don't see, and teamwork and collaboration and speaking. So I'm encouraging the secondary school to get a public speaking project going to try and get some training done there, because I do think it's, well, as you'd expect as a fellow speaker, I feel that public speaking is extremely important. And actually, I wasn't able to speak early; it came a lot later, and we're hobbled by those expectations, aren't we? We sort of receive these messages, we internalize them, and it really deeply affects our confidence.
Yes. Let's see your artifact, Ben. What did you bring with you today?
Well, I was wondering whether I should give this chap a name. I don't know. Is this Bob? Is this Bob the Brain?
Bob the Brain.
Bob. It's making me think of can't remember. So Bob the Brain. Bob Brain. The brain reminds me. So this little fellow here is the pituitary gland, and what this helps me to remember. So the pituitary gland is responsible for triggering cortisol, the stress hormone. So when we're triggered in work, in life, and we're feeling stressed, the flight and fight response, this just helps me to remember that it's this tiny little prehistoric part of the brain that's being triggered. And we have the whole prefrontal cortex, all the intellectual, rational side of the brain that can actually override that. It requires developing techniques and requires habit, but it kind of helps to remind me of who's in control and who can be in control. So that's Bob.
Very good. Nice to meet you, Bob.
Blackadder, that's it. Thank you, Peter. Yeah. Bob from Blackadder.
Yeah.
That's
excellent.
Coming to mind.
The other thing that was quite interesting, and when I asked you about if there's any artifact like visuals or any bits and bobs you wanted to show the group, you sent me a lollipop.
Yeah.
What's that about? Here it is, folks. What's this about?
Wow. So we're talking about storytelling, aren't we? And this so lollipop, the Afia tone lolly, is where is a way that I teach people to write different communications, and it helps everything from writing tweets, social media, that sort of thing, through to annual reports. And it's a process for thinking about, thinking through what you're writing about and thinking who's on the receiving end of it, so that you can frame that story and tell it in a way that connects. Okay. So shall I run through it quickly?
Yeah, run through it. We've got 15 minutes, so run through it.
So the first step is really about understanding your audience. And it's interesting that this comes at the start, but people don't seem to kind of think of it or remember it. So whenever we're communicating in order to communicate an idea. We're trying to get an idea across. And so the who, the audience, the people that we're trying to connect with are really the most important people in that, because if they don't receive our message, if they don't hear our story,
Yeah.
then that communication's been pointless. It hasn't achieved an objective, has it?
No.
It hasn't worked.
Can I ask? I mean, that obviously that's a very interesting because I've seen that as well. Have you any wisdom on? Because one of the things I used to get when I had a proper job, when I was a consultant, was that people would say, "Well, my audience is everybody."
Yeah.
Now you and I both know that that's not true.
Yeah.
Have you any guidance on that from you? You don't need to have. It's just a question that came into my head. But
absolutely, of course I do. Well,
yeah.
Of course I do, Scott. Yeah, and I get that question only just a few weeks ago. So we're communicating to thousands and thousands of people. How can we pick on just one person? But when I'm running workshops, this is what I encourage people to do: to imagine one person and create a day in their life. Give them a name. Tell me about their job.
Okay.
And the reason for that, and it's a trick that copywriters use generally. Or writers in general, is to imagine they're writing to one person. And the famous story here is Warren Buffett, the world's greatest investor. So when he's writing his annual letters to shareholders who are city types and understand finance speak, he actually imagines that he's writing to his aging sisters who know nothing about finance. And he writes to them. So he tells a story that human beings who don't have a financial background can understand. And it's a masterpiece in simplicity every year when it comes out.
Right.
So if you imagine somebody, it helps to shape what you're writing, what you're creating. If you don't have somebody in mind, then you're too broad and it becomes generic and becomes very bland.
Dynamite advice. Advice. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So next up in the lollipop, what have we got here?
So the next step is what? So what's the focus? What do you want that audience? So you've got your person in mind. What do you want them to think or to feel or to do differently as a result of whatever it is? So if it's a story, if it's fiction, how do you want them to feel? If it's if it's messages for your business, you're writing a web page or you're writing an email, what do you want them to feel? What do you want them to think? What do you want them to do as a result of it? And homing in on one very clear focus is quite crucial, because I think I came across a saying recently that more is less. So the more messages you try to pack in, the less likely they are remembered. Right. And actually, I'm working on actually, you'll like this. I'm working with an HR human resources team at a global consultancy at the moment, and I'm helping to write a behavior framework, a leadership behavior framework. Right. And there are sort of 5 layers, there are 5 words, and they each have a cascade of things, and there's a load of detail under that. It's a very, very complex model, and interestingly, it uses very complex language as well. One of the things that I sort of pick up on in language is using about simplicity of the words that you use, especially when we're communicating in business. So a lot of the longer words that have a sort of a Latin or French or Latin origin, and 50% of English is French, but a lot of those longer words are the words that we associate with power and authority. It's what William the Conqueror brought in 1066 when he came in and duffed up the Anglo-Saxons. And for hundreds of years after that, these bigger Latin origin words were the ones that we associate with power and authority. So if you're in the law or in business or in the court, that was the language you use. But the thing is, that language isn't trusted. The Anglo-Saxon got pushed underground, but was continued to be used amongst family and friends and in relationships. So the simpler Anglo-Saxon language is the language we trust. So isn't it interesting how businesses, when they're trying on their gravitas, use all these big words, but that's not the language we trust. It's just not the language we trust. So it's flawed. I don't know why nobody teaches this. So
well, I'm sure you're trying.
I am. So the second stage is, what do you want people to think or feel or do as a result? Try to be single-minded about that.
Okay. And then why? Big subject. Why
on earth are they going to care? So you've got your audience. You're clear on what you want them to think or feel or do. The next thing is, why should they care? Sometimes I call this, what's going to inspire them, or what's your hook? What's the why? Okay. And this is what's in their interest. And it's amazing how hard it is to get away from, things that we're keen to talk about, the stuff that we want to say, and get into the minds of our audience and think, what's in it for them? What's going to inspire them? Why will they care at all? And quite often when you look at the points that people will put in any sort of communication, you realize that a lot is really not a very good fit,
Yes.
and it has to go. So you have to be ruthless. And this is something that novelists have to practice.
Yes.
Something about slaying your darlings or something. I can't remember the quote.
Yeah. I mean, I took great lessons from Hemingway with that, because he very famously had such simple language. You know, you would never say that was extremely interesting. You would always say that was interesting. You know, you would,
Yeah.
and I am quite often when I'm writing for things like, if I'm telling a little story on LinkedIn or on Twitter or whatever, where you've got a word restriction, it's funny how restriction is actually quite powerful, because it makes you take out all the padding, doesn't it?
It does.
It helps me. I'm not sure it's the same for everybody, but it certainly helps me. But, okay.
I think there is a simplicity that is growing certainly in business language or in the language of organizations, because it's really about communicating ideas, isn't it?
Yes. No, absolutely.
There was a good podcast, not all in the mind. So Radio 4 podcast, what's the language one, with Michael Rosen. One over the summer I was listening to, and it was on NHS language, and somebody who's looking after the NHS website, and they were saying why they're now using language like piss and poo.
All right. Okay.
That's the language that people understand, as opposed to urinate and defecate.
Yes.
So even the NHS is understanding, and especially with the literacy level of the population, especially if English isn't this language, that they have to be fairly simple, much simpler than the language, than the Latin origin language that the medics learnt in their training.
Yes, that's such a good example. Such a good example, guys. I'll find that podcast and I'll put it in the YouTube version of this.
Yeah.
And then next up, step 4, you've got where.
Yeah. So where do your points fit? So you've got your audience. You know what you want them to think, feel, and do differently. You know why they should care. So you've got your hook. Now it's about organizing or arranging your points. So how are you going to tell that story?
Okay.
And the story has a beginning and a middle and an end, as we're often told. But it's then arranging the points. Now, the thing that this sounds simplistic when we're not looking at a real example, but when you're actually looking at a communication and you've decided what your outcome is, what your focus is, and you've decided why they should care, then your range looks very different. So before you'd gone through that process, you were going, well, we need to say this and we need to say that and we need to say the other, and we've got to say this as well, and so that department, and legal need us to say this, and HR wants us to say that. So you end up with this cacophony of messages. When you've got that objective clear, you've effectively written like yourself a mini brief, if you like, in creative agency language. Then what should be included and what isn't included becomes very clear. And so this is about arranging those points. I get people to do them in bullet points, and then to write something from scratch, write their story, write their letter, their email, their marketing piece, their website, what it is, and start again from scratch.
Right. Okay. That's pretty clear. I love that cacophony of messages. That's definitely something that I can vouch for, having worked in HR for 20 years. My goodness.
And the legalese.
It's horrendous. And then we've got how.
So how is about how you're going to express it. And it's about, this is where I suppose you might call this a bit of marketing jargon, but tone of voice, brand tone of voice, or brand language.
Yeah.
So this is where the personality of the organization or yourself is going to come through. And this is interesting because quite often the language that we're using is not the language that we intend to use. Give you an example, a nice story as an example. So on Tuesday, I was talking to the boss of my accountancy firm, and I'm not going to mention any names for obvious reasons, but so I hired them. They're a lovely firm of people, and the accountant who works on my books every month and sends me an email and tells me the things that I need to look at and the questions that she's got. And when we chat, she's absolutely lovely. She's charming. She's funny. We have a lot to talk about. We have a lot of banter, which is a bit worrying because on the clock. But it's good to have a good relationship, and that makes for good working.
Yes.
And so we get on really well, and I like her as a person, and I know they're doing a good job. But when I get the email telling me that wouldn't be 100% allowable by HMRC, so we won't put it through the books, or we'll put it to director's loan, or questions over ways that I've accounted for certain things, she does it in a tone and she uses the passive sentences, like it was assumed that da, 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 rather
Yes.
than we thought, rather than we thought. I feel a bit told off. It feels a bit passive aggressive, and I feel
Yeah.
like I'm having a finger wagged at me.
Yes.
And that's not the feeling that I want from my accountancy. I'm paying them to do a job for me, for God's
Yes.
sake. Now, this is the same for any business.
Yes.
So I emailed the boss and I had a good chat with her on Tuesday. And I said, look, the thing is, I know you're doing a great job and I love your team, genuinely. But when I get that email, it really triggers me.
Yeah.
I feel angry. Once a month,
Yeah.
I feel angry.
The power of language right there.
Is that how you want me to feel?
Yes.
And the answer is obviously no. And the antidote is tone of voice. And it's learning techniques like how to use active sentences rather than passive.
Yes. Yes. And the final part's on the stem here.
Yes.
Effective writing.
Effective writing. So that's the core running through it. That's what we're aiming at. Effective writing. And what do I mean by effective writing? I guess it's writing that hits home. It's writing that achieves a result. And if it's pure storytelling, then the result may be emotional.
Yeah.
If it's in business or in any other organization, it's usually trying to communicate a message.
Right. Okay.
And so does that message land? Has it been effective? And if it's not been effective, it's not achieved the result you want, then it hasn't been effective. You need to look at it.
Yes. And I think if we get a chance to talk again, Ben, I suspect, given all the comments I'm getting, because there's no way I can get through them tonight, we could dive into that. But would you mind if we finish just by reflecting on a couple of questions from people, because people are clearly engaged in this, Ben, and would like your thoughts. So we've got one here from Peter, and it's really interesting because it dovetails really nicely with what Joanne said earlier. Peter said, couldn't agree more about language limitations limiting your experience. Fair enough, Peter. I get so much more from my Spanish trips, especially my Caminos. Peter walks the Caminos, the pilgrimages in Spain, because I speak Spanish to Spanish people who don't have a word of English. It's a whole population you don't otherwise have access to, and it's rich.
Yeah.
I mean, that sums it up, doesn't it, really?
Well, I have a great example. My daughter Lottie, when she was in junior school, she had a friend, a mate who was Portuguese. It says he's Portuguese, and what was really interesting was that they would, they talk Spanish, Portuguese to them as much as possible, so they would learn their language. But when they were giving a bollocking, they would do it in English because it's much more direct and more precise.
Yes.
In order, to get a sharp point across, they would do it in English.
Yeah. In my house, then I do it in Scottish.
Yeah.
It takes it up another. Sam says, "Oh, you're going full on Glasgow there, Scotland." Oh dear, I've been shouting again. So the other ones come in from someone on YouTube, Renuven, which is Andy. We teach STEM lessons to our children, but we forget how important the missing A is. Some American arenas teach STEAM. STEAM emphasizes art as an important part. Without creativity, we lose out. Wow.
Yeah.
Can't disagree with that.
And I suppose, could we think of art as a shortcut for the humanities in general? So, the role of the humanities is to question and to interrogate and understand the way in which we do things, the way society operates. So if we don't have rich humanities, and if we don't focus on art and other humanities enough in school, we're not leading enough people into academia and other form of humanities, and so we're not questioning what we're doing, and that I think is a fundamental problem for our culture and our sense of selves as a country, as a nation, as multiple nations, as regions. So yeah, I can't agree more with that.
So folks, we've come to the end. I can't get through any more questions, I'm sorry. If we get a chance and if Ben is willing, we'll have another chat sometime, I suspect. But Ben, if there was one thing that you think people should have at the forefront of their mind when they're trying to communicate with others through language and story, what would it be? One thing. Big question.
I might bring Bob back in just to make a sort of surprise last experience entrance. So, when we're trying to communicate, when we're trying to reach people's brains, this is where the processing happens. But when we're trying to reach the brains, we're doing it through various senses. We need to engage those senses, and in order to engage those senses, we need empathy. And empathy means focusing on who that person is, what's going on for them at the time that they're going to receive your message. Without that, you can't make sure your message connects. It's going to miss its mark. So I guess it would be empathy. The way to the brain and the way to behavior is through empathy and understanding.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Ben. That's been a tremendous hour. We've kept you a bit longer than I suspected. I thought we would. Sorry for that. But what a tremendous hour. Can I, on behalf of everyone that's been tuned in tonight and those who watch us on rewatch, thank you very much for your deep and your rich content. It's been fantastic, Ben. Thank you.
You're most welcome. It's been a lot of fun, Scott. I think we could have carried on for another hour, but we won't.
I think we could, and it could be more than just an hour, mate. So, thank you very, very much, Ben. Good night.
Thanks for having me on.